Across Ukraine, peaceful lives have been shattered by incessant bombing, while homes and infrastructure have been destroyed. One of the most devastated cities is the besieged port of Mariupol, where Ukraine says 100,000 civilians are trapped without food, water or medication.
In a hospital in Kyiv, Olia is feeding her daughter Victoria, who is just 1 month old. The baby survived Russian shelling because her mother used her body as a shield. Her father recounts how their apartment block was targeted.
I woke up because Olya was screaming, and it was accompanied by the sound of glass crashing, an alarm, fire, a catastrophe. I just heard Olya shouting, turned over and threw a blanket over them.
Attacks on residential areas, schools and hospitals have become a daily occurrence in the war. With Russian troops mostly stalled outside Ukraine's main cities, they are resorting to bombing from afar. Speaking in English and appealing to the world, Ukrainian President Zelensky called for a universal show of support.
Come to your squares, your streets, make yourselves visible and heard. Say that people matter, freedom matters, peace matters, Ukraine matters. Russia is trying to defeat the freedom of all people in Europe, of all the people in the world. It tries to show that only crude and cruel force matters.
Despite the destruction Russia has wrought, Ukraine says it will not give up fighting. But the price of its defiance is a country laid to waste.
And to bring us up to date, I'm joined by our correspondent, Fanny Fachar. She's in Lviv in western Ukraine. Fanny, thanks for joining us this morning. Give us the latest. What are you hearing where you are in Ukraine?
As we have just heard in that report, the devastation, the shelling, the explosions continue to especially hit hard Mariupol. We have heard so much about that town, which is really bearing the brunt in all of this, where you really get the most harrowing pictures from. And not only Mariupol, obviously, other parts in the Donbas region as well, also towards the north, places like Kharkiv, Kherson, Sumy, all names that basically the world got to know during the past 4 weeks when this war began. But also explosions reported from Kyiv. So the situation here in Ukraine remains very, very dire for so many people. Millions are displaced. At least 1/4 of the Ukrainian population has been displaced. Many of them have left towards the Polish or Romanian border, across the border. But at least 6 million are displaced internally because of this war that began exactly 1 month ago today, on February 24th.
Now, President Zelensky has asked people around the world to protest against the war. What do you make of this call? Do you think people will answer this call to action?
We have seen demonstrations worldwide in many parts of Europe and elsewhere, even before, prior to this announcement. What I find quite interesting in that call to take to the streets, that he actually did it in 3 languages, in Russian, in English and in Ukrainian. And especially in Russian, he made clear that the Russians should also realize that this is not their war and they shouldn't basically buy into this Russian propaganda, he says. But he also called on the politicians. There are several summits to take place today, G7, NATO summit, EU summit. President Biden is also here, in Europe. And so he called basically on politicians to not risk a division amongst them, but to actually also have a unified response to stop this war. So a very emotional address once again from President Zelensky there. But what's quite interesting here in Ukraine, the people who actually decide to return to this country now against all odds and despite the war that's going on. We met one woman here in Lviv who wants to show resistance by returning here and help her local staff to secure their jobs. Let's have a listen.
They escaped horror, their last stretch boarding one of these trains to Poland. Lyuba and her 2 grandchildren took 4 days to get here from Kharkiv, a city heavily bombed.
At home in Balaklia in the Kharkiv region, horrible things are happening. There are bombings. Dead bodies are lying around in the village. 2 villages were completely destroyed.
Her grandchild, 16-year-old Kirill, doesn't know if he will ever return to Ukraine.
I will stay with my parents in Poland. I will study and live there somehow.
The images of people fleeing Ukraine, most of them women and children, ingrained. However, a small but growing number is headed back to Ukraine, most of them men ready to fight, but it's estimated 1 in 5 is a woman. A woman like Lilia, a designer. She fled from Kyiv on the day the war began to France. Now she is back.
It's impossible to leave my team behind. I need to give people jobs, faith in the future. That's why I'm here. My return is about supporting Ukraine and those who don't know whether to return or what to do, how to live.
Shaken by the brutality of this war, she says she wants to secure jobs for her team, who all had to flee from Kyiv. She's able to give work again. In this wedding dress factory, she found a temporary workspace.
My message to all women who are abroad and who may think about returning and what to do here, I want to tell them, we have the strongest men in the world. We will win and can overcome anything.
Despite the optimism, the war is present here too. Our interview interrupted by air raid sirens.
Oh, the air raid siren again. Girls, if you want to go down, go.
Oh, it's terrible.
The siren is going on?
Yeah.
I'm afraid because it's unpredictable. We need to stay alive.
The factory can be a target too, Lilia explains, as we head to the bunker. But just how responsible is it to ask others to return to Ukraine now? Lilia makes clear
Everyone is responsible for their own actions. And everyone decides for themselves what they do, what they say, the choices they make, what Ukraine means to them. This is my choice.
And the consequence of their choice of leaving or returning plays out here at this train station in Lviv.
Fanny, the invasion started a month ago. You were in Kyiv at the time. Take us back to that day. What was it like?
I remember basically waking up to what I first thought was someone slamming the hotel room door real hard, to then realize that this was an explosion followed by several other explosions that early morning shortly after 4 a.m. It was a situation where people were under shock, where journalists that were in the same hotel where we were staying were under shock. People were basically going down on the road to report, while others were remaining in the hotel trying to report from their balconies, not knowing just, is it really the beginning of the war? Is it just a few explosions and that's it? So there was confusion, but especially shock on the ground. I've seen people who were trying to flee as soon as they could. Already, by the way before the door, you could feel this tense atmosphere in the air. And nobody, when the war broke out, when this full-scale invasion began, actually thought that it's going to happen. We spent there the week leading up to this full-scale invasion, and there was so much speculation, so much discussion going on if there's going to be an invasion and whether that's just going to be just, in quotes, in the Donbass region or elsewhere. So a day in history 4 weeks ago where we still do not know what the consequences, the full-scale consequences are going to be as this war wages on, the Russian war against Ukraine.
Fanny Fachar in Lviv, thanks so much for your reporting. And here's a look at some of the other developments in the war. A reporter working for an independent Russian website has been killed in Kyiv. News outlet The Insider said Oksana Baulina died when Russian forces shelled a suburb where she had been filming damage from an attack. At least 5 journalists have now died since Russian troops invaded Ukraine 4 weeks ago. A top Kremlin aide has become the first member of Putin's inner circle to quit his post over the Russian invasion. Anatoly Chubais was Putin's envoy to international organizations, but he's better known as the architect of Russia's post-Soviet economic reforms. Poland has expelled 45 Russian diplomats, accusing them of being Kremlin spies. A government spokesperson said it was part of Warsaw's dismantling of the Russian Special Services network in Poland. They've given most of the group 5 days to leave the country. Moscow has called the accusations absurd. Now, it's a big day for diplomacy in Brussels today, with the leaders of NATO, G7 and European Union countries all coming together for talks on how to deal with the war in Ukraine. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg was among the first to arrive for an emergency summit of alliance leaders. US President Joe Biden is also in the Belgian capital and will be taking part in all of today's consultations. Now, speaking ahead of the start of the talks, NATO chief Stoltenberg said Russian President Vladimir Putin made a big mistake by invading Ukraine and that the alliance needed to prevent the conflict from spreading.
We meet here at the NATO headquarters facing the most serious security crisis in a generation. We need to do more, and therefore we need to invest more, and there is a new sense of urgency. But we have also made it clear that we will not send in NATO troops on the ground or NATO planes in the air. We do that because we have a responsibility to ensure that this conflict do not escalate beyond Ukraine. That will cause even more suffering, even more death, even more destruction.
And for more of that, we can cross straight to our Brussels correspondent, Bernd Riegert. Bernd, we just heard NATO Secretary-General Stoltenberg there saying we need to do more, but also that NATO won't put boots on the ground or planes in the air. How can NATO do more? And are there any signs that what they're doing is deterring Putin?
Some member states will deliver more ammunition, more anti-tank missiles and more anti-aircraft missiles to Ukraine, to the Ukrainian army, so that they can fight. But otherwise, the military toolbox of NATO is quite empty, and NATO so far was not able to deter the Russian war machine or even to influence the course of the war. NATO is rather concentrating on its own defense, and calls from President Zelensky of Ukraine, who will be a guest via video link of this NATO summit, will go unanswered. There will be no fly zone. There will be no fighter jets for Ukraine. And now NATO is in reinforcing its own capacities. There will be 4 more battle groups stationed in the east, and also more troops from the United States coming over. But this is to prevent that the war spills over and that NATO gets drawn into this conflict. So not much to deter Russia, actually.
Let's talk about unity. The first days of the war were marked by strong unity by EU and NATO members. 1 month into this conflict, does that unity still hold?
Well, it does. The message of these 3 summits today here in Brussels is unity and resolve. There are internal discussions about what can be done more sanctions, more help for Ukraine. Especially Poland comes forward with some proposals like a peacekeeping force by NATO, but this has no chance to be realized because other member states say that it will not happen. So the front, if you can say that, is quite united. And this is also the purpose of this whole endeavor today, to show Russia that the West is still united on this and wants an end of the war and wants an end of the war crimes.
Bernd Riegert in Brussels, thanks so much. Now, Vladimir Putin believed his invasion would result in a quick victory. Instead, his army has become embroiled in a bitter war, one that has seen the Russians target civilians. A warning, this next report contains images that some of our viewers may find distressing.
An apartment block under fire. This is Mariupol, the Ukrainian city Russia has been targeting since the start of its invasion. Targets include its citizens, who've paid a heavy price. This distraught mother holds her sleeping child. Her other child was killed in Russian shelling. For those still here, there's little left.
We have nothing to eat. It's awful. It's just awful. No light, no heat, nothing.
Russian forces have attacked schools.
Yeah, he freed us from education.
And community buildings. When this theatre was bombed, it was acting as a shelter for hundreds of people. It's still unclear how many died. Hospitals too have been targeted. This pregnant woman who was filmed being rescued from Mariupol's maternity hospital later died, half an hour after her baby was delivered stillborn. Since the war began a month ago, there have been more than 60 attacks on Ukrainian medical facilities, including hospitals, according to the World Health Organization. Over the last few weeks, Russian air power and artillery have struck at residential areas in other cities, like Kharkiv.
How could this monster, oh my God, monster come up with something like this, to destroy everything? People are starving, there is no water, no wood for heating, and he decided to destroy a city. In the 21st century, a beautiful city.
1 month on, it seems no one, not even children, are safe in Putin's war.
I'm joined now by DW reporter Roman Goncharenko from DW's Russia, Ukraine and Eastern Europe department. Roman, it's very difficult not to be terribly moved by images that we've just seen in that report. It's clear that Putin's war is devastating Ukraine. Has this war, though, now also become a disaster for Russia?
Well, yes, of course, but in a different way. So Russian cities are not bombed. Russian children are not dying. They are not hiding in shelters. Millions of Russians are not fleeing the country. Some are, but it's a minority. But on the other hand, of course, it's a disaster for Russia because the Russian economy has been hit the hardest since the fall of the Soviet Union, and it's just developing, Western imposing new sanctions on Russia. And this whole period, 30 years after 1991, it's over. It's done. Russia is a pariah state now, and it's a disaster.
You mentioned the Western sanctions that are crippling the Russian economy. Yesterday, Putin announced a plan to try to force the West to boost his economy. Let's take a quick listen.
A number of Western countries have taken illegitimate decisions on the so-called freezing of Russian assets. This collective West has actually drawn a line under the reliability of its currencies. You've already spoken about this. It crossed out the trust in these currencies.
Could this attempt to force Western countries to pay for gas in rubles work, given many European countries are very dependent on Russian gas?
Well, we don't know because it's a completely new situation. We've never had it. And it could work for some time at least because Western countries, especially here in Europe, are very dependent on Russian gas. But on the other hand, they are making plans to get rid of that dependence by the end of this year. My guess is that this will happen sooner. And Russian plan to support its own currency, to support its central bank sanctioned by the West, will probably work for a couple of weeks or a couple of months at most. But then I think the sanctions will force also the Western side to get rid of Russian gas and to end that dependency.
We've been hearing this morning Ukrainian forces have made advances against the Russian Navy near the port city of Berdyansk. What more can you tell us about that?
Well, it's a new development, and we have some reports from Ukraine that in the occupied city of Berdyansk on the Sea of Azov, some Ukrainian partisans managed to attack a Russian ship, a big warship, It's probably the biggest success for the Ukrainian army so far on sea against Russian warships. We know the reports that the ship sank, and we know that the ship was the first to come to the occupied city of Berdyansk a few days ago, and it brought a load of APCs, armored personnel carriers. It's a ship that could carry up to 40 APCs or up to 20 tanks. So it's a huge loss for the Russian army.
Roman Goncharenko from DW's Russia, Ukraine and Eastern Europe Department. Thanks so much.